One ordinary night patrol turned into a nightmare when a police officer pulled over a black man for a minor traffic violation. Arrogant and abusing her authority, she ordered him out of the car, forcing him against the vehicle without just cause. When he remained calm instead of showing fear, her frustration exploded, and smack, a slap echoed through the silent night. But then, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge, Chief of Police. The officer's face went pale as she realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. The story doesn't end here. Don't forget to subscribe and like to see what happens next. A police patrol car cruised slowly down the dimly lit street, its headlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The night was quiet, but the officer inside the vehicle remained alert. At the intersection ahead, a sleek black sedan made a right turn without signaling. The officer's eyes narrowed, just a minor traffic violation, yet something about the situation made them decide to act. The patrol car's lights flashed blue and red, illuminating the road. The black sedan smoothly pulled over to the curb without hesitation. The officer adjusted their uniform, placed a firm hand on their holster out of habit, and stepped out of the vehicle with a controlled authority. Approaching the driver's side, they knocked on the window. The glass rolled down, revealing a middle-aged black man in a well-tailored black suit. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his expression calm and composed. "Good evening, officer," he said evenly. "License and registration," the officer replied, voice firm but devoid of courtesy. The man reached into the glove compartment, retrieved a leather wallet, and slid out his license before handing it over. "What's the violation?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Failure to signal," the officer stated flatly, glancing at the documents. The man nodded, as if expecting the answer. "A minor mistake. But enough for you to pull me over?" The officer's jaw tightened. There was something about the way he spoke, too composed, too sure of himself. "Step out of the vehicle," they ordered. The man hesitated for a brief second before unbuckling his seatbelt. He opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, his movements measured and controlled. "Is this necessary?" he asked. Hands on the car. With a quiet exhale, he turned and placed his hands on the roof of the sedan. "You don't have to do this," he said, voice calm but laced with an underlying firmness. "I'm not a threat." "Be quiet," the officer snapped, moving closer. Their hand reached for his shoulder, but instead of a routine frisk, they pushed him forward with unnecessary force. He staggered slightly before regaining balance. "You're overstepping," he said, inhaling deeply. The officer felt an inexplicable irritation rise within them. There was something about the way he carried himself, as if he wasn't intimidated in the slightest. A split-second decision. A loud slap cracked through the air. The officer's hand had struck the man's face. For a moment, everything was still. The man remained in place, his posture rigid. His fingers curled slightly before unclenching, his breath steady. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, turning his head slightly, his voice devoid of anger, just a quiet warning. Something inside the officer twisted. A sudden wave of unease crept up their spine. The man reached into the inside pocket of his suit. The officer instinctively tensed, hand hovering over their holster. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a badge. The officer's eyes dropped to the credentials, and their blood ran cold. The name on the badge was unmistakable. The man standing before them was the police commissioner. The officer's breath hitched. Their heart pounded violently against their ribs. Another patrol car pulled up behind them. A second officer stepped out, immediately recognizing the man. "Sir. Is everything all right?" the newcomer asked, eyes flickering between the commissioner and their colleague. The commissioner gave the officer in front of him one last glance, calm, unreadable, but filled with something worse than anger, disappointment. "I assume I'm free to go?" he asked, his voice quiet. The officer swallowed hard. Their mouth opened, but no words came out. Finally, they managed to whisper, "Yes, sir." Without another word, the commissioner stepped back into his car and drove away, the tail lights fading into the distance. The officers stood frozen on the sidewalk, sweat beading on their forehead, hands trembling slightly. They had just struck the highest-ranking officer in the department. And they knew, this was far from over. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with an uneasy energy. Officers exchanged glances, whispers floating between desks like drifting smoke. No one spoke openly, but everyone knew. The news had spread faster than wildfire. One of their own had assaulted the commissioner during a routine traffic stop. Inside the chief's office, the air was thick with tension. The officer sat stiffly in a chair, hands clenched together on their lap, shoulders tight. Across the desk, the police chief sat unmoving, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" the chief finally spoke, his voice dangerously calm. The officer swallowed hard but nodded. "Yes, sir." "Do you?" The chief's voice hardened, his piercing gaze locking onto the officer's eyes. "You laid hands on the commissioner of this department. You humiliated him on the street, in front of civilians. And for what? A routine traffic stop?" The officer shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. "Do you have any idea what this means for you? For this precinct? For me?" The chief leaned forward, pressing his hands flat against the desk. "The commissioner hasn't filed a complaint, yet. He hasn't demanded disciplinary action, yet. But do you honestly believe he'll let this slide?" A muscle in the officer's jaw twitched. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was." "That's your defense?" The chief scoffed. "You don't get to treat people differently based on who they are. But you also don't get to manhandle a superior officer." Silence filled the room, stretching the tension to its breaking point. The chief exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. "You're on administrative leave until further notice. Effective immediately. Badge and gun, now." The officer's heart dropped. "Sir, please. Don't make this harder than it already is." The chief's expression softened for just a moment before hardening again. "Badge. Gun. Now." The officer hesitated, then reached into their belt, unhooking the holster. With slow, deliberate movements, they placed the firearm on the desk, followed by the badge. It felt like stripping away a part of themselves. "Go home. Wait for further instructions. And pray the commissioner doesn't decide to end your career entirely." The officer stood, every step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. As they reached for the handle, the chief spoke again. "One last thing." The officer turned back, gripping the doorframe. "Do yourself a favor. If you run into the commissioner again, apologize. If he gives you the chance." The officer swallowed their pride, gave a stiff nod, and stepped out into the precinct. The room went silent as they walked through, eyes burning into their back. Their career, their reputation, everything hung by a thread. And they had no idea what would happen next. The officers sat in their dimly lit apartment, the weight of the suspension pressing heavily on their chest. The silence was deafening, save for the occasional hum of passing traffic outside. A notification buzzed on their phone, a message from an unknown number. "Meet me at Riverside Park. 10 minutes. Their pulse quickened. They didn't recognize the number, but something told them exactly who it was. The commissioner. Without hesitation, they grabbed their jacket and stepped outside, the night air crisp against their skin. The park was nearly empty when they arrived, save for the figure standing near the water's edge, hands in pockets, posture unreadable. The officer approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "You called?" they said, their voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The commissioner turned slowly, eyes unreadable under the dim glow of the street lamp. "Walk with me." They hesitated but complied, footsteps echoing against the pavement. After a moment, the commissioner spoke. "Do you know why I didn't report you immediately?" The officer swallowed, shaking their head. "Because I wanted you to sit with it. To feel it," the commissioner said. "Not just the fear of losing your badge, but the weight of what you did." They stopped walking. The officer clenched their fists. "I get it. I messed up. I overstepped. But what do you want from me?" The commissioner studied them for a long moment before speaking again. "I want to know what you've learned. And I want to know if you're ready to face the consequences." The officer looked away, the street lamp casting their shadow long and uncertain. "I don't know," they admitted. The commissioner nodded, as if expecting that answer. "Then figure it out. Because this isn't over." With that, the commissioner turned and walked away, leaving the officer standing alone in the night, the weight of their choices heavier than ever. The officer and Detective Harper left the witness's apartment, their minds racing with the new lead. The streets were still alive with the hum of late-night activity, but for them, the night was far from over. Harper lit a cigarette as they reached the squad car. Ricky was running with the wrong people. If this was a hit, someone wanted him gone for good. "We need to find out who." The officer exhaled, trying to process everything. "Where do we start?" Harper took a long drag, exhaling smoke into the cold night air. "We pay a visit to our friendly neighborhood loan shark." They drove in silence, the weight of the case pressing down on them. The address they had for Ricky's last known employer was a small bar on the outskirts of town. Dimly lit, the place had the kind of atmosphere that made newcomers uneasy. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the murmur of quiet conversations. A few sets of eyes flicked toward them before looking away, disinterested. Harper led the way to the back, where a man sat alone at a booth, nursing a glass of whiskey. The man looked up as they approached, his sharp eyes scanning them quickly. "Detective Harper," he greeted, voice smooth but edged with suspicion. "What brings you to my establishment this fine evening?" "Cut the crap, Vince," Harper said, sliding into the seat across from him. The officer remained standing, keeping an eye on the room. "We're here about Ricky." Vince's expression didn't change. "Ricky who?" Harper leaned in, his voice dropping lower. "The Ricky you had running errands for you. The one who just turned up dead." Vince swirled his drink, watching the liquid move. "That's unfortunate," he said finally. "But Ricky wasn't my problem anymore. He had debts, big ones. And when someone like him can't pay up, well, you know how the world works." The officer tensed. "Who was after him?" Vince sighed, as if already bored of the conversation. "A man like Ricky doesn't just owe one person. He owed a lot of people, and he was running out of options. Last I heard, he was desperate to square things away with someone big. Someone who doesn't take kindly to being shortchanged." Harper's eyes narrowed. "Name?" Vince smirked. "You don't want to get involved with this guy." Harper didn't budge. "Try me." Vince finished his drink, set the glass down, and finally met their eyes. Elijah Cross. The name sent a chill down the officer's spine. Cross wasn't just another thug, he was one of the most feared enforcers in the city, known for making debts disappear, along with the people who owed them. Harper nodded, standing up. "If you're lying, Vince, we'll be back." Vince chuckled. "I never lie, detective. But be careful. Some names shouldn't be spoken after dark." As they left the bar, the officer exhaled sharply. "What now?" Harper glanced at them, expression grim. "Now? We find Cross before he finds us." The officer and Detective Harper sat in their car, engine idling as they stared at the abandoned warehouse across the street. The building loomed in the dim light, its rusted metal frame casting long shadows. This was where Elijah Cross was supposed to be hiding. Harper exhaled, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You sure you're ready for this? Cross isn't just some low-level thug." The officer nodded, checking their sidearm. "We don't have a choice. If we wait any longer, he'll be gone." Harper smirked slightly. "All right then. Let's do this." They exited the car and moved cautiously toward the warehouse, weapons drawn. The air was thick with tension as they pressed against the cold metal door. Harper signaled a countdown with his fingers, 3, 2, 1. He kicked the door open, and they rushed inside. Inside, the warehouse was dark except for a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Wooden crates lined the walls, and the scent of motor oil and damp concrete filled the air. The place seemed empty, but both officers knew better than to let their guard down. A noise echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then, a voice. "Took you long enough." Elijah Cross stepped out from the shadows, a smirk on his face. He was tall, built like a prizefighter, with cold, calculating eyes. In his hand, he casually spun a knife between his fingers. "Detective Harper," Cross said, his voice smooth. "And you must be the officer everyone's been talking about." Harper tightened his grip on his gun. "You've got nowhere to run, Cross. Drop the weapon and come quietly." Cross chuckled. "Run? Oh, you misunderstand. I've been waiting for you." Before Harper could react, the lights in the warehouse shut off, plunging them into darkness. A scuffle broke out. The officer could hear grunts, the sound of fists meeting flesh, and the unmistakable scrape of metal against metal. Heart pounding, they moved carefully through the darkness, trying to locate Harper. A gunshot rang out. Silence followed. The officer's breath caught in their throat. "Harper?" A groan answered from somewhere in the dark. "I'm fine," Harper called out. "But Cross is gone." By the time the lights flickered back on, the warehouse was empty except for the crates and the faint scent of blood. The officer clenched their fists. "We need to find him before he disappears for good." Harper dusted himself off, his expression unreadable. "Then we'd better move fast." They split up, searching the warehouse for any sign of where Cross might have escaped. The officer checked behind crates, knocked over barrels, and even examined the walls for hidden exits. Harper called out from across the warehouse. "Over here." The officer sprinted over to find Harper crouched near an open sewer grate. "Looks like he had a backup plan. No way he got out of here through the front." The officer peered down into the dark tunnel. "So what now? We go after him?" Harper hesitated. "We have no idea what's down there. Could be a setup. Could be a dead end. We need backup." The officer's jaw tightened. "If we wait for backup, he'll be long gone." Harper sighed, rubbing his temple. "All right. But we go in together, and we don't take any unnecessary risks." They climbed down into the tunnel, weapons drawn. The air was damp and stale, the sound of dripping water echoing through the narrow space. Footprints in the grime suggested Cross hadn't gotten far. They moved carefully, every step calculated. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the underground maze. Suddenly, a noise ahead made them stop cold. A metallic clang. Then, a chuckle. "You two just don't give up, do you?" Cross's voice echoed from the darkness. The officers exchanged a look before moving forward. The chase wasn't over yet. The tunnel stretched before them, the dim emergency lights flickering against the damp walls. The officer and Harper moved cautiously, their weapons raised, every footstep echoing ominously. They knew Elijah Cross was close, he had nowhere else to run. A sharp noise ahead made them freeze. The officer signaled to Harper, and they crept forward. Turning a corner, they spotted Cross at the far end of the tunnel, his back against a rusted service door. Blood trickled down his arm, his breathing labored. "End of the line, Cross," Harper called out, his voice steady but firm. Cross let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "You two really don't give up, do you?" The officer stepped forward. "Hands where we can see them. This doesn't have to get any worse." Cross shook his head. "You think you've won? This whole thing, it was never about me. I'm just a piece of the puzzle." Harper narrowed his eyes. "Then start talking. Who are you working for?" Cross smirked, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's too late. You might have caught me, but you haven't stopped anything." Suddenly, a distant explosion rumbled above them, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The officer's stomach dropped. "What the hell was that?" Cross's grin widened. "That is your real problem." Harper lunged, grabbing Cross and slamming him against the wall. "What did you do?" "Doesn't matter now, does it?" Cross coughed, wincing from his wounds. "Go ahead, arrest me. But you're already too late." The officer exchanged a tense glance with Harper. Backup would be arriving soon, but whatever Cross had set in motion was already happening. With sirens blaring in the distance, they hauled Cross to his feet. "We'll see about that," the officer muttered, dragging him toward the tunnel exit. As they emerged from the underground, the city skyline was illuminated by distant plumes of smoke. Whatever had begun, it was bigger than just one man. Harper exhaled, watching the chaos unfold. "Something tells me this is just the beginning." The officer nodded, tightening their grip on Cross. "Then we'd better be ready." As the screen fades to black, one thing is clear: this was never about one chase, one crime. It was the start of something much larger, and they were now right in the middle of it.